أهلا ومرحبا بكم في برنامج داخل واشنطن. أنا مضيفكم روبرت ساتلوف. بوتين وحماس. خلال شهرين منذ أن بدأت الحرب بين إسرائيل وحماس، حكى الرئيس بايدن مقاربة تربط بين هجوم روسيا غير المبرر على أوكرانيا وهجوم حماس غير المبرر على إسرائيل. لا يسرد الرواية عن الدور الأمريكي الفريد في قيادة العالم المتحضر لمواجهة الشر الذي اطلقته تلك الأهداف، حيث أكد أن أمريكا وقتها بإمكانها المحافظة على وحدة التحالف الغربي لمنع أوكرانيا السلاح والدعم المطلوبين لهزيمة روسيا، وأن أمريكا وقتها من يمكنها ردع إيران ووكالتها لمنع التصعيد الذي قد يؤدي إلى حرب إقليمية في الشرق الأوسط، مما سيسمح لإسرائيل بالتركيز على حربها العادلة ضد حماس. ما الذي يفسر التزام الرئيس بايدن القوي بدعم كل من أوكرانيا وإسرائيل؟ وهل سيؤيده الكونغرس في هذه المقاربة؟ وكيف ستؤثر الانتخابات الرئاسية في سياسة الولايات المتحدة تجاه الحربين؟ لمناقشة واقع إدارة الرئيس بايدن في زمن الحرب في كل من الشرق الأوسط وأوروبا، يسعدني أن أرحب بضيفينا الخبيرين المتميزين في السياسة الخارجية، دينيس روس ووان زراتي. Welcome back to Dakhel, Washington. We are now 2 months into the Hamas-Israel war. We've just concluded a humanitarian pause with some hostages being released from Hamas in Gaza and some security prisoners, Palestinian security prisoners, being released by Israel. But the war has resumed. I'm delighted to have Denis Ross and Juan Zarate to help me explain where we are now likely to go with the resumption again of hostilities. Thanks for joining me, gentlemen. Denis, war has started again. What are we likely to see in the next phase?
Well, I think in the next phase, we're going to see a campaign in the southern part of Gaza that will not be an exact replica of what we saw in the north. It will not be preceded by the same extensive bombing that went on for several weeks before the ground campaign began. It also will have to be adjusted to take account of the fact that nearly 2 million Gazans are now in the southern part of Gaza. Many, if not most, are there because the Israelis encourage them to move from the north. So the Israelis have to take that into account, not only because they probably would in any event, but also because it's become a very significant part of the Biden administration's continuing support for Israel's operations and its broader objective. The Biden administration, to its credit, has continued to support the idea that Hamas cannot remain in control of Gaza when this is over. And it's supporting the Israeli military effort to achieve that. The problem has been for the administration, the legitimate concern about what's happening to Palestinians in Gaza, the level of death and destruction, the suffering and so forth. Clearly a desire on the part of the administration to increase the level of support for humanitarian assistance and to ease the plight of Palestinians there. So that is a constraint, I think, on how the Israelis will conduct this operation. But ultimately, if the objective is to ensure that Hamas is militarily defeated and to the point where it is no longer controlling Gaza, there will be points probably where there'll be some tension between the Biden administration and the Israelis as they conduct this operation. There is no magical solution to being able to end Hamas's control of Gaza, and to do that in a way, unfortunately, without significant cost to those who live there, unless, of course, Hamas decides to surrender or go into exile as a way of saving the Palestinians of Gaza. But since Hamas has never demonstrated the slightest concern for the well-being of the people who live in Gaza. That's not something I expect anytime soon.
Juan, I know that you have experience from your government days of trying to rid a terrorist group, trying to dismantle a terrorist group in the days after September 11th. You just heard Dennis describe the objective here to deny Hamas control of Gaza, territorial control. Is this an achievable goal in your view?
I think so, Rob. But I think there's a broader existential question as to whether or not you can destroy Hamas in totality, right? And so I think there are rings to this. The first and most important, to Dennis's point, is dislodging Hamas's control over Gaza so that they can't pose the same kind of threat that they posed to Israel on October 7th and no longer have the means to govern and to run the tunnels and to run the economy in Gaza. So that's certainly achievable, not without cost and not without humanitarian concerns, as we've seen and certainly as Dennis has described. The next part is, can you then begin to dismantle the networks that Hamas has relied upon, financial, logistical, leadership, to operate not just in Gaza, but beyond Gaza? And I think that is a trickier problem, but one that can be managed. That then requires you to go after where Hamas exists, how they raise funds, how they're operating outside of Gaza, and how they persist. That's in the leadership in Qatar, the operations in Turkey, some of the training that happens in Malaysia, where they operate in Egypt. So all of that has to be a part of the full-scale dismantling. And then finally, the most difficult part is the underlying ideology, which is a violent Islamist extremist ideology embedded in the nationalist aspirations of the Palestinian cause. How do you uproot that? How do you dislodge that? How do you create alternatives? And what does the future of Palestinian aspiration look like absent Hamas as the vanguard and the ideological lead for the movement? That is a much more difficult proposition, and certainly one that has to be part of dismantling Hamas, but it's not going to happen tomorrow, and it's certainly not going to happen even with an Israeli victory in Gaza.
So I think it's fair to say, Dennis, do you agree that the third objective that Juan just outlined, it's not, we haven't heard that being expressed by the government of Israel, have we?
No, we really have not. I mean, we heard what was a kind of political shorthand of annihilation, of eradication, which were, I'd say, aspirational, but not realistic, in part because this is an idea, not just a group, in part also because it exists elsewhere. And the Israelis have been, in truth, more finite in terms of what they're trying to do. They want to ensure they never again face another October 7th from Gaza. Now, it would be nice, I think, from their standpoint, to weaken, the Islamists, the radical Islamists, more generally those who are Hamas supporters outside of Gaza, who are part of Hamas outside of Gaza, others that Hamas is connected to. But the real focus has been on dismantling the military infrastructure, destroying the military wherewithal, basically eroding the organizational coherence of Hamas within Gaza to the point where it is too weak to resist another regime that would come in and take over. The area where the Israelis really don't have an answer, at least not one they're prepared to talk about publicly, is who is the regime who takes over in the aftermath of Israel defeating Hamas to the point where they can no longer control Gaza. But their objectives have not been as far-reaching as Juan described, although it wouldn't be hard to imagine that over time, this would become part of a larger strategy, because you've dealt with Hamas, assuming you've succeeded in Gaza, it doesn't mean the threat goes away, and you're still dealing with a larger issue of making sure you discredit this group, and in a sense, this idea. I mean, the ultimate outcome has to be one where Hamas imposed this terrible price on Israel, but the consequence for Hamas was it lost control in Gaza. That will send a message to Hezbollah as well.
I mean, one, just to give us a sense of historical perspective. When we went into Afghanistan to go after al-Qaeda after September 11th, what did we think we hoped to accomplish? I mean, I'm not trying to make a neat equation between then and now, that group, this group, but was our idea to destroy the group, kill the leaders? Remind us what the goal was.
Yeah, it's a great point, Rob. And it's very similar here because there was an immediate tactical need to go after al-Qaeda, its leadership, its safe haven, largely in Afghanistan, and to disrupt any future plots that were threatening the United States. And so not dissimilar from what Dennis is describing. The objective here for the Israelis is you have to go after the group that just attacked you. You have to prevent their ability to operate and do something similar again. And you've got to weaken them in a way that doesn't allow them to perpetrate those kinds of attacks or to inspire those kinds of attacks again. So that, in essence, was the first stage of the American response. But what President Bush did, which made this a more universal campaign in that regard, was to say two things. One, we are going to disrupt and dismantle al-Qaeda and other like-minded groups. So we're not going to let this problem fester and just pop up everywhere around the world. We're going to go after al-Qaeda, but also like-minded groups. We're also going to go after the ideology, and in particular, the ideology that there's legitimacy to terror. The very debate that's happening here in the context of whether or not Hamas, as Erdogan has said, is not a terrorist group, but is a movement of national liberation. The United States said very clearly in the post 9/11 environment, the use of terrorist tactics is no longer acceptable. Like slavery and piracy of old, it is now illegal, regardless of stated purpose, the use of terrorist means. And so we then went after the ideology, and that was what the war on terror in its maximalist form really symbolized. Going after al-Qaeda, yes, disrupting and dismantling that group, but then going after the very nature of terrorism and like-minded terrorist groups so that we weren't facing cataclysmic or existential attacks from terrorist groups in the future.
Fascinating, fascinating. Dennis, we've seen a slight shift in the Biden administration in the last couple of weeks. Still strong support for the idea of Israel's right and responsibility to go after Hamas. More recently, an emphasis on protecting civilians in the war zone. Is this a shift in tone? Is this a shift in substance? Do you think it's to lay the predicate for a distancing from Israel? Or is it in its own way actually an approach that reaffirms the core support for Israel?
Look, it's ironic, but at the end of your question, I think what it is designed to do is to make it easier for the administration to sustain support for the basic objective. Now, I say make it easier because it's under unmistakable pressure. It's under pressure from our partners, our Arab partners and allies in the Middle East, who are feeling, who feel the reality of their publics being enraged by the images they see coming out of Gaza. So the administration is trying to respond to those pressures. The administration also has to take account of what are elements within the Democratic Party that are also calling for an immediate ceasefire. So in a sense, what you're looking at is the administration is trying to buy time and space for Israel, but the way it's trying to buy the time and space for Israel is by focusing on the humanitarian dimension, on raising the issue of who would come in the day after, on trying to suggest that there is a political horizon out there, because you can't fight this war and not have a sense of, well, where will things be headed later on? All of that is, I think, a response to pressures from the Arabs and also pressures from within the Democratic Party. The interesting thing is you haven't heard the president soften his tone on Hamas. You haven't heard the president soften his tone on Israel's right to an obligation to defend itself, but also that Israel shouldn't have to live with this as a threat next door. So it certainly is a shift in tone, but I still read it as being driven more by a recognition that the objective is still an objective the administration supports. There is a question: is there a tipping point where the pressures from the outside and even some of the pressures from the inside, given what is the toll in Gaza, does it reach a point where the administration decides, okay, look, we gave you as much time and space as we could, but we've kind of reached the limit of that, and that may well be an element here as also.
All right, when we come back after the break, Juan, we're going to expand the conversation. I'm going to ask you about deterrence against Iran. Is it working? What more should we be doing? Are there other steps to take to address that aspect of this crisis? We'll be back with Juan Zarate and Dennis Ross in just a moment. My guests again today include Dennis Ross. Dennis is my colleague and counselor to the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. Dennis has 25 years of bipartisan experience at high levels of government, including White House tours in the Obama, Clinton, Bush, and Reagan administrations, and service as the president's special envoy for Middle East peace. Also joining us is Juan Zarate. Juan, one of our nation's leading national security experts, is global co-managing partner of K2 Integrity, a risk management firm. He's also chairman of the Center on Economic and Financial Power. Juan served in the George W. Bush administration, holding the titles of Deputy Assistant to the President and Deputy National Security Advisor for combating terrorism. So Juan, let's talk about that regional aspect of this conflict. On one level, we've seen the Biden administration order massive deployments to the region, which help prevent dramatic escalation of this conflict. On the other hand, Iranian proxies have been busy attacking U.S. installations, attacking innocent shipping, and even from Yemen, lobbing ballistic missiles through the Red Sea up toward Israel. How do you evaluate? Have we succeeded? Have we failed? Is there something more we should be doing that we're not?
Well, I think a common theme from the Biden administration, not just in the context of Hamas and what's happened post October 7th, but also even with the Ukraine situation and war, is to de-escalate, or at least to prevent unnecessary or miscalculations that would increase the level of conflict and certainly draw the United States more directly into either conflict. And so the prepositioning of assets, of naval forces, of even personnel has been an intended signal to ensure that Iran, Hezbollah, and other actors wouldn't be more forcefully engaged against Israel. I don't think it's working wholly, Rob. To answer your question, I think what October 7th revealed is that there's an underlying proxy battle underway led by the Iranians, where Hamas, for its own purposes or for Iranian purposes, in some ways doesn't matter, engage in the attack on October 7th and upset the balance of peace in the Middle East, certainly the sense of security for Israel. And what you have now are Iranian proxies very much willing to target U.S. assets, whether it's in Syria or Iraq, out of Yemen, naval forces, threaten commercial vessels. And so they seem to me to be very much emboldened. And the U.S. has tried its best to respond, but the responses have been both after the fact and very tactical. And I think the challenge for the administration is, how do you reassert American deterrence against Iranian proxies and also demonstrate to Iran that the status quo of being picked at by these proxies around the region is no longer acceptable. That requires, I think, a degree of confrontation that the administration's not willing to engage in, and a degree of threatening toward Iran itself that the administration's not willing to engage in. And I think Iran knows that. I think the proxies are willing to continue to fire their missiles, to launch their drones, to engage in attacks that will take out American service people or even hit bases. And until the administration demonstrates that they're willing to escalate beyond the certain level of tit-for-tat responses that we've done to date, the deterrence is not going to be reestablished. And I think you're going to see continued proxy provocation in the region.
So Dennis, Juan says that we should be willing to go up the ladder with Iran and target certain Iranian assets directly. What do you think?
Well, I agree. That's probably the only way you're going to change the Iranian calculus right now. The Iranians basically are quite aware that we don't want to escalate. On the other hand, they've also been pretty sensitive to the reality of our increasing forces deployed in the area, which is one of the factors, not only one, but one of the factors of why Hezbollah has sought to keep the conflict highly localized with Israel. It clearly doesn't want an all-out war. I don't think the Iranians want to be sucked into a war, but they see that we are more concerned about escalation, and that gives them a level of reassurance. The only way you're going to change the Iranian calculus and change what are the series of acts we see going on that you raised with Juan and Juan described is if the Iranians suddenly decide that the price is too high to them. Right now, that's not the case. So unless the Iranians were to see that they lose an asset that they value, and by the way, their attitude towards their proxies is they've always been quite willing to fight to the last of their proxies. They're quite sensitive about their own casualties, not so sensitive about the casualties of their proxies. So unless you can engage that, I don't see how it changes. And to be fair, I understand the administration is also trying to buy time for the Israelis. I think there's a consideration on the administration's part. If they look like they're acting in a way that suggests escalation can take place in the region, that may actually work against our ability to resist ceasefires when it comes to the Israelis. So there's an interrelationship here that's a complicated interrelationship. It's easy to say that we should raise the cost to the Iranians. We have to think about when we do, how does that affect the other priorities we have right now?
Not to make this even more complicated, Juan, but we almost forgot Iran is still making progress toward a nuclear weapon. Are they possibly using this war as a cover to inch closer to the bomb?
I think that's right. And I think that's one of the main concerns that the Biden administration has, and frankly, why they don't necessarily want to escalate more directly against Iran. I think they don't want to either upset the potential of some sort of Iranian nuclear deal, which has always been kind of the Shangri-La hope, I think, of this administration to have that kind of a deal. But also they don't want to necessarily be blamed for provoking the Iranians to accelerate their movement toward nuclear capability. That is to say, if the US were to strike in Iran, and I would argue, you could say to the Iranians, if we are hit again by Iranian drones, any American service member or asset, we will strike and destroy the drone factories in Iran. That, by the way, would also help the Ukrainians who are being hit by Iranian drones provided to the Russians. But that would be a real escalation, and that would be seen perhaps as an act of war, and perhaps as a reason for the Iranians to further accelerate their move toward a nuclear weapon. And so this is a very delicate balance, and the Biden administration certainly doesn't want to have that problem on their hands in addition to everything else they're dealing with.
All right, Juan Zarate, Dennis Ross, thank you both joining us this week on Dakhel Washington. Thank you. بهذا تنتهي هذه الحلقة من برنامج داخل واشنطن. إن كانت لديكم استفسارات أو تعليقات حول هذا البرنامج، وخاصة حول العلاقة بين الرئيس والكونغرس والحرب على غزة، يرجى التواصل معي عبر تويتر على هاشتاغ Inside Washington أو مراسلتي مباشرة على @RobSatloff. أراكم الأسبوع القادم. إلا ذلك حين شكرا لكم وإلى اللقاء.